Welcome back. Starlink users in South Africa are facing a major setback this month as the satellite internet service provider has warned that it will terminate services for those who are violating its terms and conditions. Thousands of users across the country have received notifications that their internet services will be terminated by the end of April. Joining me now to discuss this is my Broadband Editor Jan Vermeulen. Jan, good morning. Thank you so much for making time for us. First of all, let's start off here. What is Starlink?
Starlink is an internet satellite system that is in low Earth orbit as opposed to geostationary orbit. And that gives it several advantages at certain costs. So the big advantage to Starlink is it's much faster and lower latency than regular geostationary satellites, but it requires a lot more satellites to cover the whole globe, and also the satellites have a decaying orbit, so they crash back to Earth. They burn up in the atmosphere, and so SpaceX has to constantly refresh its fleet. Yeah. But bottom line, think of it like a 5G system, but in space. Yeah. And you have to have direct line of sight to the satellite. So unlike our regular cellular networks that have some form of indoor penetration, you can use your cell phone in a house. With satellites, you have to have a clear view of the sky.
Yeah. So, and Starlink is, of course, owned by SpaceX, which is owned by Elon Musk. Why is it that Starlink couldn't find an operating license in South Africa? Why are they being accused of violating terms and conditions?
Yeah, our industry regulator, ICASA, hasn't issued the required operating licenses in 13 years. And the reason is that if they can only one of the licenses, it actually needs two licenses, an IECNS and IECS license. And one of those licenses can only be issued by ministerial decree. Our Minister of Communications has to publish basically a proclamation allowing the industry regulator to issue the license. I don't know why the I is in ICASA for independent, because it's not independent. It only does the bidding of the minister in cases like these, and it's deeply frustrating. It's deeply frustrating for the industry, and it's not just Starlink that it's frustrating. It's frustrating local entrepreneurs as well. But then the other side of that is that South Africa, for those licenses, has local ownership requirements. So you have to be 30% BEE owned. But what's meant by BEE ownership is historically disadvantaged groups. So that includes black people, youth, women, people with disabilities. And so that is something that Starlink doesn't really do. In Kenya, it received an exemption from their local ownership requirements. Starlink deals directly with customers. And so there's some concern here locally in South Africa that Starlink will essentially disintermediate local internet service providers. And so they're still busy figuring that out. Yeah. And I've heard that there's negotiations with existing license holders. So examples of people who own licenses are our mobile operators, Vodacom, MTN, Cell C, Telkom, Rain. There's also internet service providers that own the necessary licenses for Starlink to offer services in South Africa. But that means Starlink would have to partner with that company, and then it would have to apply for the necessary spectrum licenses through that company to offer its services legally in South Africa. And it just doesn't sound like that ICASA and Starlink have found one another there. Part of the problem was, back when Starlink was looking at launching in South Africa, there was a lot of regulatory uncertainty. ICASA was talking about changing the local ownership requirements to not just be historically disadvantaged, but black only. And I think that gave Starlink a scare, and they just put South Africa to the bottom of the list. So we're basically last in line for Africa to get Starlink now as a result of those shenanigans.
Yeah, because you have, is it Eswatini already is providing Starlink services, as well as Mozambique? And Mozambique. Yeah. So the complexity, though, of that is also that I understand that some Starlink users or people who use the Starlink services are able to tap into the Mozambique as well as the Eswatini network. Is that the truth?
Yeah, so that was now before. That was now before this notice that Starlink issued that said that they're going to cut that off at the end of the month. So Starlink has what they call a global roaming and a regional roaming service. The global roaming is the most expensive, and then regional roaming is slightly cheaper. And so what South Africans or people in South Africa have been doing is they would import kits from elsewhere in the world. So they would import kits from, say, Europe and then activate global roaming. But then when Starlink started launching in Africa, they would import from Rwanda, when it started moving closer from Mozambique or Eswatini. So you order the kit to be delivered to one of our neighboring countries. Then you import it into South Africa. As far as I can tell, that's perfectly legal. It comes through customs. You're not smuggling anything in. You declare it to SARS. You pay your tax. All of that is done perfectly legally. It's not blocked at the border. So that seems to have been sorted out. Even though ICASA says that the equipment is not type approved, they're not blocking it at the border for whatever reason. And so people have been importing the kits quite legally, but then using the service is technically unlawful in South Africa, even with this regional roaming service. So that's what people have been doing. They would import the kit, pay Starlink for regional roaming, and then use it because Starlink just didn't switch off its satellites when they come over South Africa, except over the square kilometer array in the Northern Cape. So we've been able to access this regional roaming service, but technically that is breaking the law. And it's not just breaking the law in South Africa, it's breaking the law everywhere in the world where they've got spectrum licensing requirements, which is everywhere in the world. Starlink needs at least spectrum licenses in every country it operates.
Yeah. If we compare Starlink's prices to that of our local network providers, the ones that you mentioned a bit earlier on, does Starlink still come on cheaper?
Starlink competes pretty aggressively against uncapped 5G. But when it comes to fiber and that sort of stuff, I think you're still going to get a cheaper connection from a local provider. It depends on what speeds you're looking at. So you can get uncapped 5G where your speeds are limited and the amount, and they've got fair use policies, like they start throttling you when you've downloaded 50 gigabytes and that sort of thing. So when you look at true uncapped services, where there's no fair use policy, no speed throttling, nothing like that, Starlink is relatively well priced, but it's still quite a bit more expensive than fiber of a similar speed. But obviously we know fiber doesn't get everywhere. So Starlink's real strength is that it was able to provide people with 5G-like or fiber-like connectivity in deep rural South Africa. So people on farms that have been completely underserviced, in villages that are underserviced, any kind of underserviced community, these kits have been a lifesaver. And not just for residential users. We know of businesses who we can't name because I don't want to get them in trouble, but like big fast food chains in this country, banks in this country that have started adopting Starlink for these underserviced areas so that they can continue offering services out there, or offer better services out there. And all that is set to go up in smoke at the end of April as well. Sure.
Then why is the government not pushing ahead with getting a Starlink the operating license, if you consider the big debate also being around the data inequality or access to data and the inequality at that particular level, specifically when we speak about what's happening in rural areas? And we saw, for instance, with the auctioning of the spectrum, the big debate there was around the costs that are involved, the infrastructure that is not there, the infrastructure that wasn't in place. And here you have somewhat of an alternative, and yet we're not pushing ahead with that?
Yeah. So a couple of there's pragmatic reasons. So one of them is that the government is going to want to protect our local industry. At least I hope so. And our regulator, ICASA, is certainly going to have been receiving inputs from industry associations and members of the industry to say, hey, listen, we can't just let Starlink run roughshod over our laws and regulations in South Africa. It will destroy a industry, a satellite reseller industry in the country, and potentially long-term be a threat for our cellular networks even. We'll see. The technology isn't quite there yet, but it could be a Netflix-like moment for the connectivity or telecommunications industry in South Africa. where Starlink ends up disintermediating our cellular networks. That might be 10 or 15 years away, but you want to make sure that the regulations are in place today so that if Starlink becomes a threat to Vodacom and MTN down the line, they're playing by the same rules. So that's one aspect of it. The other aspect of it is that there's a political thing here. And so the DA has been using Starlink as for political grandstanding and talking about how useless the ANC is. And so now there's like this offensive, defensive thing happening politically. And then there's the BEE political football as well, where, you know, it's been, although Starlink has not said it itself, it's really an open secret that it's not a fan of policies like BEE in South Africa that requires a certain amount of ownership by a certain group of people. And so that's a hot potato, a political hot potato as well. And so there's several factors conspiring together that's made government, I think, not as interested in dealing with SpaceX around Starlink. And then on top of it, SpaceX only has so many resources to commit to this, and they are talking to the countries that are making it easy for them to get the licensing they need and to launch in the countries and to launch in their countries. And South Africa has made things relatively difficult, and so we're really just at the bottom of the priority list. So government might be able to try to get a hold of SpaceX, but it's going to take quite a bit of work to get South Africa moved back up that priority list when there's so many other countries on the continent that are making it way easier for Starlink to launch there.